Good afternoon. My name's Ken McCarty. I'm the Natural Resource Management Program Director for the Missouri State Parks. I'm also the facilitator for this session on insect conservation, and I'll be giving you your final presentation. Bee communities exist in a lot of modern settings. You can think of agricultural lands, urban settings, rural pastoral landscapes, field borders, roadsides, utility corridors, different kinds of public lands, restoration areas, ecological reconstructions, and so forth. Many of the presentations in our conference so far have dealt with a lot of different kinds of these, and many of them being the kind of development influence sort of systems that we live in today. This presentation will take a look into the other side of the spectrum, looking at some of our biggest and our best kinds of natural systems that exist in the Ozarks of Missouri. And it will specifically focus on those kinds of large landscapes and high quality natural areas that exist within our Missouri State Parks. And you can think for a minute that the Missouri State Park system is over 100 years old. Many of the parks that were established in the early decades of the 1900s were created as state parks because they were already great nature places. They were the scenic landmarks and the geologic wonders of the day. They were given that state park status, and through the decades that followed, they've been protected as natural areas and natural landscapes. As we came to the 1980s and we had an even larger focus on understanding the natural history and ecology of these sites, we entered a phase of exploration. We began a series of protective designations, state natural areas, state park wild areas, ecological management units, and we instituted programs to bring process back to these kinds of systems. Our prescribed burn program, invasive species control, and other kinds of practices to convey the quality of these sites forward through time. So they are some of the biggest and best, and these are the kind of sites I began in 2016 to seek out the kinds of bees, the communities that exist in these kinds of Missouri Ozark natural settings. Or as the slide says, we started looking at who's out there from the bee perspective. And we'll begin, as I slide, with an understanding of what kinds of natural systems we have in Missouri. Yesterday in the plenary sessions, you saw maps of the native vegetation. Maps showed the Great Plains to the west, the prairie regions in the southern part of Minnesota. Moving north, you entered the belt of broadleaf deciduous forest, and north and there the coniferous systems and other kinds of systems that make up Missouri or Minnesota's native vegetation. Now, Missouri exists due south of Minnesota on the other side of Iowa, on the other side of that prairie peninsula. So we have the reverse in that kind of natural vegetation development. We have the Great Plains to the west, our prairie regions in the northern part of the state, our broadleaf deciduous forests and woodlands are in the southern part of the state, and our coniferous systems, our shortleaf pine, which is our one pine species, being in the southern part of that. And then you see the boot hill of the state, the extreme southeast, which is actually the upper end of the Mississippi embayment, with our extensive 2.1 million acres of bottomland hardwood forest and cypress swamp in our early historic times. So in a broad brush stroke, that's the general vegetation pattern in Missouri. The survey is going to, and the information I'll give you today will focus on the Ozark region. And you see a mix of colors within that broadleaf deciduous forest in the oak pine system to the south. The color bar shows the lighter the greens, the more open the natural community type, the darker and deeper the green, the more towards the forest end of the spectrum. That the landscape existed according to the GLO data when the state was surveyed in the early and mid 1800s. And with that kind of broad brush stroke, I want to give us all a sense of understanding of what these natural systems are across the Ozarks with a photo tour, a quick photo tour across the Ozark Highlands using images from the study sites themselves, from our state parks, from these kinds of natural landscapes. Now, the Ozarks is a dome uplift. The land rose and the valleys carved down into a very intricate kind of hill and valley system that is responsible for a lot of the kind of diversity that we see across the region today. And beginning at the high side of the top end of the dome, across, you would find these prairie and savanna openings. I have one of those indicated on the map at the bottom of the screen. Radiating out from those prairie and savanna plains, high on those watershed divides, you would find areas of deeper soil, level topography, heavy clay, even frangipans that was water impeding. And there we had some fairly extensive areas of oak-dominated flatwoods. Not so deep, but rather shallow or rocky or droughty. You have barrens, as they were often termed by early travelers and explorers. If you were to move off of those plains, following any of those ridges that head up the major watersheds and rivers and streams across open woodland communities. If you were to walk out that ridge and decide to turn right or left down into one of those developing hollows through the Ozarks, you would eventually, as you walk down those hills, reach an area where the bedrock is thick, massive, shallow, droughty soils, in a hilly, rocky, prairie-like community we call our Ozark Glades. Continue walking downhill past that glade zone, you would be back into woodland environments, more closed in this setting, the herbaceous plant community makeup being somewhat different, responding to the deeper shade, the deeper soils, the higher internal moisture content. Hit that drainage and continue following it down its path into those deep, dark hollows, and you would find our true forest settings in the Ozarks of Missouri. Now, wade your way through that, continue down the drainage, those tributary hollows that are narrow, low slopes, and you're going to find upper terraces on broader floodplains where you have these flatwoods communities again. Stepping off of those terraces and as floodplains broaden, you'll have, and then you have the streams and river corridors themselves. Here at Coakley Hollow, typical Ozark bedrock bottom stream. And if you were to walk on either side of that, you would find with that very saturated kind of soils, and you would find our versions of fens, the Ozark fen communities, which were also part of the study. And the other thing to note is there's a herbaceous community in the light alongside the shorelines of these Ozark streams that is in itself a source and a place to find bee communities. Well, that said, I've taken a look across the whole Ozarks in a very broad brush stroke of the major landscape themes that exist. Now I want to scale it down to the size of a unit of public land, or specifically a state park, to get a sense of the kind of communities and the variety and diversity that exists that would support a bee community. Here I take Bryant Creek State Park, 3,000 acres in size. And within that 3,000 acres, there are 30 natural community types. And in fact, of all those different landscape types I just showed you across the Ozarks, every one of them exists within this 3,000 acres, except for the prairie and savanna communities. So from a community perspective, it's very rich, it's very diverse. And within those 30 natural communities on those 3,000 acres, there exist 940 species of vascular plant. And you can imagine that can be quite a substrate from which a bee community could develop. Well, let's scale it down more to the level of an individual bee seeking pollen. Oh, no, first let's take a look at just a single natural community, not 30 natural communities combined in one unit, but let's take a best of type dry chert woodland, which is one of, as I said, one of the most. And let's take the Nature Conservancy's Bennett Springs Savanna. Again, it's the best of type. It's 40 acres in size. It's a single natural community type. But in that 40 acres of just one natural community, there are 366 native plant species. So again, quite the opportunity for a fairly robust bee community to develop. Now let's scale it down one more time and look at the floral opportunity from our sampling, monitoring data across the span of years and different sites in the Ozarks. We typically find in our closed woodland settings that we will encounter 10 to 20 species of vascular plant per 1/4 meter square sampling frame. In the more open woodlands, more light rich, and where we start getting more of some of the prairie influence into these woodland communities, we will typically encounter 18 to 20 species in a 1/4 meter square plot. And in the richest ones, we'll hit 25 and even occasionally into the low 30s species of vascular plant in a single 1/4 meter. So with that said, those are the vegetation types that we find across the Ozark. And this is the kind of community diversity and species richness that we find within those systems. And so that said, let's now start taking a look at the survey and the results. Given those kinds of landscapes and the biggest and the best that we have within the state parks and throughout the Ozark and especially, I was wanting to look at what are the bees that are found in those kinds of systems, what are the natural communities with which they associate, and on what host plants will they be found. So the survey began in 2016 and has continued each year up through this spring, at which time I took a break to start compiling. See from the map the locations across the Ozark and the Ozark border region. And you'll note that there are 17 parks from which I've collected data altogether, and they span the entire. And within those 17 parks, there were 7 where I had season-long sampling focus. We're beginning with the very first green up in spring and ending after frost with the very last flowers to still be present. I collected at 2 to 3 week intervals and then follow up in subsequent years to try and fill gaps in plants or timing. Altogether, there's 6,000 records. They are all collected by a net at the flower because I wanted to collect the kinds of information that you see in the sample of a data sheet. The Natural Community Association and the host plant ecological land type for each and every bee that makes a part of this reference record. And here's a sample of the results from a single park. Burn River State Park, 526 specimens from 61 host plants. Missouri has 460 plus species of bees known from the state. Within this one landscape, 32% of those were pollen specialists. 20 of those are considered to be conservative in Missouri. 9 of those were regionally uncommon or rare for Missouri in the Ozarks. There were 2 Missouri species of conservation concern that were collected. There were 2 new records of occurrence for Missouri and 2 specimens that are undescribed. So that's a sample of what we collected from a single park and the kinds of information that sort of drives you to want to do this kind of thing, to see especially where some of the kind of special ones are, and those are high interest to conservation. But now, given that one park, let's zoom out to all 17 sampling sites and look at what they tell us collectively for all those kinds of natural communities across the Ozarks. Altogether, from those 17 parks, collected. Roaring River was fairly typical, and you can see from the 7 focus parks that I consistently, for my survey intensity and techniques, was able to collect plus or minus 100 species at each of those sites. The distribution across the families was fairly consistent for the 4 common ones. With, we're looking at 57 to 61 species between those 4 major families, and then 13 species. One of the community characteristics that we have relates to is the pollen strategy, particularly the ratio of the pollen specialists was a 2-to-1 ratio, which is pretty high for other studies that have taken place in Missouri, and may relate to the fact that we are looking at some of our Vesta type kind of natural systems. Also, we have a fairly high number of our kleptoparasitic bee species. That's not complete at this time. I still have quite a few, especially of the nomata and the tripiolas to go through to get a total on that. Another characteristic of bee communities that we are interested in as we try to describe what those might be in these kinds of large natural landscapes is the nesting habits. And for those 248 species of bees collected, 3/4 were wholly or in part ground nesters. That left 60 that are above ground nesters, 6 that nest in rotted wood. Relative abundance is another factor that's interesting in trying to describe bee communities of these large natural landscapes. Of the 248 species, there were actually, and it was a surprise as I pulled all the data together, there were only 48 that I term as being widespread species that would have been collected in at least 6 of those 7 focus parks. That's less than a quarter of the total species being widespread, even though the individuals might be quite abundant among those. The other side of that is the high number of unique species. There were over a third that were found in only 1 or 2 of all 17 sampled parks. And to look at some of the parameters on this, of those 72 unique bee species that were collected at all, they comprise 70% of the conservative bee species found in this survey. 38% of the regionally uncommon or rare bees found in this survey, and they represented 30% of kleptoparasites that are so far identified. And you might think in terms of those fairly high percentages that is perhaps a characteristic of the kinds of large natural area quality landscapes that this survey focused on. Let's look at the flip side of that, though, because I think it has some information as well. There were 176 bee species that were collected at more than 1 park. And of those, they represented 30% of the conservative bee species collected in the scope and scale of this survey. 62% of the regionally uncommon or rare bees, and over 2/3 of the kleptoparasites so far identified. And that too may be a reflection of the kinds of places where we are sampling, looking at the best of type kinds of natural systems in our largest landscapes and seeing this kind of distribution among the conservative bee species and this number of regionally rare ones. And then I want to zoom out again to all 248 species. So, we looked at the beginning at Roaring River State Park and taking all 17 sites collectively, the 148 of Missouri's 460 species at these Ozark, dry woodland, and glade parks, 46, almost 20%, are conservative species in Missouri. 32 of those individuals, or 13% of the survey total, are regionally uncommon or rare in Missouri. There were 9 new state records that were collected during the time of the survey. And then the last line is an interesting to me and probably others as well who deal with managing native plant communities in natural areas where we deal with so many exotic plant species as we try and manage these natural systems. For the entire years and number of parks and intensity of sampling that I did with the bees, I came up with a grand total of 4 non-native bee species. One of those is ubiquitous. It's everywhere all the time. You can probably guess it. It's the European honeybee. The other 3 were most uncommon. There was only 1 or 2 occurrences, period, of those. So at least within these Ozark communities, these Ozark systems where we have the large landscapes and high quality natural areas, there is not a large intrusion of the non-native bee fauna into our native ones. And with that, I've gone through sort of the basics of the structure of a bee community in these large native Ozark, Woodland, and Glade landscapes. There's another storyline, which is not time for today, but is a story for another day, but I will briefly touch on it. And that's the host plants. There were 6,015, I said bee records, actually it's host plant records. There are 2 plant species. Quite a range in spectrum here from these systems of host plant information in the study. And to touch briefly on one of the aspects that we are interested in as we think of the plants sitting on the landscape. So what comes to it and functions as a pollinator? And here I'm talking about bees specifically. There were 115 bee species collected at Roaring River State Park. And if you look at some of the more common or descriptive kinds of plants that exist in these different natural communities that exist there, you see that most of them are visited by a lot of different bee species. And if we take one from the woodlands and glades, you look at the gray-headed coneflower. 23 of those 115 bee species, that's about 20% of the species collected in the park, were found as well, if not exclusively, on gray-headed coneflower. So there's a lot of visitation by a lot of different species of bees on these different kinds of plants in almost every case. And then I'll take just a few individuals as I close it out. Certain plants are markers for us in terms of quality in a natural community type. Scurfy peas are one of those that we find in our open woodlands, our glades, our prairies. I collected 175 of those 6,000 plus bees, 42 species of bee. 5 of those are pollen specialists, 5 are conservative in Missouri, and 3 are regionally rare from those 2 species of scurfy bee. Lead plant, 34 species of bees were collected Ozark-wide using this. I say scurfy peas and purple prairie clover. 2 pollen specialists, 2 conservative species, 2 of those are regionally rare. There was 1 undescribed species collected from purple prairie clover. Plant, 45 bee species, 5 of which are pollen specialists. Coneflowers, 32 species of bee, 9 of which are pollen specialists to the coneflowers. 3 are conservative and 2 are regionally rare. And we could go on, and we will at some point pull together some of the information that relates to the bee use of the plants in these different natural communities. But with that, we've running through our time and our information for today's general look at bee communities in these dry Ozark, Woodland, and Glade ecosystems, and its best of type and largest kinds of landscapes. And I'll close out by giving some thanks to those who have allowed the use of their photography, and particularly to Mike Arduzer for the time and expertise he provided in checking poaching and checking identifications, providing information on the different aspects of the bee community and so forth. So with that said, I thank you all for participating in this presentation and in this session for the Natural Areas Conference. Thank you.